Welcome everyone. Welcome to a very special podcast episode. Today we're going to do a little bit of research. Our research question is going to be: do US athletes lose incentives to perform upon signing big guaranteed contracts? We're going to look primarily at the major Big Four, so-called Big Four leagues, which are the National Football League, Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, and the National Hockey League. And that is going to, of course, happen with a very special guest of ours. His name is Andris Szo. Like me, he's also a student in international sport management at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. But before all, he's not only a fan of American sports, he's almost an expert of American sports, primarily specializing in the NFL and the National Basketball Association. We're going to look at two case studies with him, but before we start our discussion, I would like to take to informatively to describe my findings upon my literature review. So I look primarily at two peer-reviewed articles. The first of those was published by Krautman and Solo in 2009. It put the disincentivizing of which could be caused by fully guaranteed contracts against opposing incentives on effort and performance. Like for example, the year before your contract ends, if you're going to sign another contract after that, you'd have to push yourself, despite the disincentivizing that comes from the guaranteed money in the last few years of the guaranteed contract. Their key findings, the results of their key findings are that players are kind of clustered into two categories. If a player is expected to sign the new long-term contract after his current contract, usually the performance towards the end of that contract is good. Whereas players who are expected to retire due to factors such as age, such as uncertain market, their performance usually declines statistically significantly. Um, the second of those articles was released by Khan in the year of 2000. It states that in the era of free agency and long-term contracts, players spend more time on the disabled list, supposedly because they can take the risk of not playing because the money is guaranteed anyway. Something that is called in the scientific landscape is called moral hazard, and thus in this study it's called moral hazard response. Also, another finding is that players without anti-injury incentives in their contract spend more than twice the amount of time on the disabled list in comparison to players who did have such incentives for not getting injured, financial incentives for getting awards at the end of the season. And combining the findings of those two articles, we can clearly see the pattern that unless some measures are taken, fully guaranteed contracts and contract insurance, career insurance, usually leads to a declining performance. Does our guest think that? We'll see in the following discussion. Okay, Andres, before we get into the case studies, first let's start with some general talk about around the topic. In 2013, the average per player salary on the 53-man squad in the NFL was about $545,000. In 2022, it was about $860,000. Question is, good players are rewarded better than ever. Has that translated into a better on-field product overall in the big four sports, in particular the NFL and NBA?
Yeah, but I think it's tough to say really because every situation is just so different. You can't just always say that every player who gets a big contract is gonna underperform after because let's say they potentially got a life-changing amount of money and therefore they don't have the same passion for the game. Let's say. But I think, it depends on the person really, or the athlete. I mean, you see Patrick Mahomes, for example, got a huge contract a couple years ago, 10-year contract for, what was it, 450 million dollars, obviously. And then he still has exceeded expectations. He just won another MVP, I mean. But then you go to some players, like, as we're going to go into later, Carson Wentz, then he got a big money after having some really good seasons, and then he just fell off completely. It's just tough to tell. It's really always personal. You can't just generally combine all the athletes into one. uh, yeah, like one group. I think yeah, it's a personal thing. Teams, organizations have to be really good at identifying the players, not just the players and how they perform on the field, but also their personalities and how much potentially a new contract would change their perspective to the game, their attitude. So yeah, I would say it depends on
Yeah.
on the situation.
Let's get into our first case study. It is about Albert Pujols, a baseball player, a star in Major League Baseball. He started his career with the St. Louis Cardinals. He played there for his first 10 seasons. He had probably one of the best 10 season spans that any player has had to start his career. Um, then in 2011, he signed with the Los Angeles Angels. He signed a 10-year contract worth $254 million. We're going to get into that. And everything, all of his stats fell down dramatically. In 12 seasons, in 10 seasons with the Angels, he had a batting average of 256. With St. Louis, it was 326. The on-base percentage was 311. With St. Louis, it was 417. And the wins above replacement average per season were 1.29 compared to 7.4 with the St. Louis Cardinals. So the pattern and the thing that most people would assume, and something that was actually kind of predicted by some, we're going to get into what the media said, but the pattern that people would imagine here was that he played incredibly because he wasn't making as much money. Then he got a huge guaranteed payday. As we know, in MLB, contracts are fully guaranteed. And then after that, he really had no reason to push himself.
I mean, as you can see by the numbers, there was a huge decrease. I mean, even as someone who doesn't follow the baseball or the MLB that closely, I can tell the difference by those numbers. And yeah, I mean, I think baseball was the first really like major league that introduced these like really long contract, like 12 year long contracts. Because in the NFL, NBA, you don't really see that. Maybe a couple longer extensions, but never like 10 years, because it's such a huge commitment, not even just money wise, but also like just year wise, like time spent. Then yeah, you have to pay him for what, 10 years on the payroll, depending whether or not he's on your team or not. I would say with Pujols, it's probably fair to assume that yeah, he just kind of lost some of the, maybe not the passion, but some of the interest after he received so much money. I mean, because the drop off from one season to another, maybe it's not that noticeable, but over time you can see that his career with the Angels has been just so disappointing compared to everything else he did before. And I think like aging also is part of it. I mean, what is he like? He's above 40 now, right?
Yes.
Like
He's now retired.
Yeah, so he's retired now. But yeah, he was also aging a lot. So I don't know how much that's
a fair argument, because that's a fair argument, because you can use that as a counter argument to people who say it's because of guaranteed money. You can say it's because simply you're not as good when you get older.
But then again, you have to think about it. I have to ask the question: then why did they give him the big contract when when they knew well before that he is gonna he's gonna get older, he's gonna age, and most likely his numbers are gonna drop off eventually. Maybe the 10-year contract was just an insurance in order for them to have prime Pujols for maybe a couple of years, and obviously that didn't turn out the way they thought it would. So maybe they just try to make a 10-year contract for so much money in exchange for potentially one or two title wins. But then, I mean, obviously with his performance dropping off, that just never quite happened. So he took a risk and it just didn't work out.
Yeah, they didn't win a single World Series. I'm not sure if they even got to the... I think they've been to the playoffs twice. In that span. And in that span they had Mike Trout as well, and for a few years they had Shohei Ohtani, were the two best players in MLB.
Trout and Ohtani, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and this can't do anything. So
yeah.
Maybe it's just the franchise. Maybe they're just unlucky.
Yeah. The thing is, you made a good point. The question should be, if you have a counter argument which goes against the guaranteed money theory, you say, still, why did they give him such a huge contract? The thing is, in baseball, it's very difficult for one player to make the difference. That's not the NBA. The reception of a player having failed after a big contract, and also why are big contracts given? Maybe there's a quote that's gonna at least bring this to a further discussion, if not give us the answer. This is by Jason Hoover of the Bleacher Report in December 2011. That's when Pujols signed his contract. Albert Pujols is about to learn what Alex Rodriguez has been well aware of since his time in Texas with the Texas Rangers, where he played before the Yankees. Once you leave home for that big money contract, the expectations are impossibly high. Baseball players are paid based on past achievements. The older a player gets, the tougher it becomes to reclaim that past glory. When a player eventually flounders due to age, fans in the new city will not remember the highlights and glory moments from the years past. They will simply see the amount of zeros still left on your contract. Maybe because the contracts are so expensive, we just perceive them to be a failure, whereas many times it can be an undercover success for the team.
Yes, I mean many times you really just look at the numbers with the contract, and then you kind of decide on that based on whether a player was a good signing or not a good signing. A lot of times players do perform well still after signing big contracts, but unless they perform at the superstar level, you're just gonna hear all the negative things about them. You're not gonna hear, but yeah, I mean he's still someone's still um, borderline top 10, let's say, after signing a huge contract. That's still fine, but most fans want their top paid player to be the best in the league, and then if the results are disappointing, then fans are gonna be upset. And as the coach said, a lot of a lot of fans remember a lot of great players uh, after their prime, because they played for their team after their prime. For example, maybe only a couple of years, maybe they were injured, and that's their perception of the player after, which changes a lot for fan bases as well. So yeah, I mean, if contracts weren't public, I would say that there would be much less talk about this, obviously.
Mhm.
But the fact is, you just have to be transparent in today's world with the contracts and everything. And then obviously, a big contract, whether or not the player is gonna be good or not after signing the contract, you're gonna face criticism whether or not the player played well or not. So that's just the tough part of being a franchise team in one of these big leagues. I mean, you people are always gonna put the blame on the general manager, the players maybe to an extent, but at the end of the day, fans will always blame the team, and you have to make smart decisions, obviously, but it's impossible to only make good decisions. So yeah, I mean, teams are in a tough situation with this. Yeah.
Yeah. And many times, despite what fans say, it's not always possible to negotiate a cheap contract, because once a player, as they said, based on past performance, they're paid based on past performances. And once a player has been as good as Pujols was with St. Louis, it's not. It's they have so big of a bargaining power, so high bargaining power, especially if they're represented by a guy like Scott Boras. In case you don't know, Scott Boras is like the most powerful agent, maybe in all of American sports, and it's impossible to negotiate a cheap contract. And considering that the floor is not very low, you might have, even if the player underperforms, you might have ended up getting a good deal, because a better deal was never in the books.
And the thing is, as time goes on, more and more players are going to sign new contracts. So the highest value and the average value as well is going to go up. So every time you have to pay a player because their contract is up or they've just exceeded expectations, and you have to give them a new contract, the number is always going to go up. You see it in the NFL every year, every off season. They set multiple records by position for new signings. I mean, if you, yeah, as you said at the beginning, there's just such a big difference in the average salary from 10 years ago compared to now. It's just a lot of huge contracts to be given out. Players obviously want to demand a bigger contract, better contract for themselves. And yeah, as you said, I mean, they basically have all the power, because the teams, what they can do is like trade them instead. But then again, it is obviously known that the player wants to be traded, so they don't have as much leverage over the other teams, so they might not get as much in return if they traded him. So the players usually do have a big advantage.
And sometimes you might even have to assume some of his salary
Yep, that's also
if
part
he's
of
not
it.
performing.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, now let's move on to our second case study. It is about a topic much closer to you, much more familiar to you. Carson Wentz, he was the Philadelphia Eagles quarterback. He was after his first 2 years in the NFL, I believe. He signed in June of 2019. He signed a contract extension, which was for 4 years, worth 128 million, including 107.9 million in guaranteed money, which is a big number in the NFL where contracts are not fully guaranteed.
Even in 2019, I would say over 100 million guaranteed was a big number. So
Yeah. Just to give the audience a quick overview, in 2018, his last year before the extension, he had a completion percentage of 69%. That is a very good achievement. Then the extension happens. In 2019, he was still solid. He was actually fifth. He was fifth in the Comeback Player of the Year rankings. He had a 64% completion and 27-7 touchdown interception ratio. And after that, it was all downhill. He has three straight years with sub 60% completion, with less than 60% completion percentage. He changed 3 different teams, and he's currently a free agent. So, is that the same pattern where people can freely say, oh, he had guaranteed money, then he stopped playing? Or is that first year after the extension to show us something?
See, this is why this is such an interesting situation, because it's not like he just immediately fell off after signing the extension. Like, as you said, the 2019 season was still very solid for him. And then after that, I don't know like how much you remember. Like for me, the 2020 season, I vividly remember just every week I watched the Carson Wentz or like Eagles highlights, and he had an interception, he had a fumble, something bad just happened, bad decision making. I don't know, something just weren't right with him. I don't know if it was a mental issue with him, but he just looked like a completely different quarterback compared to his first 4 seasons there, because in his second season he practically led the Eagles to the Super Bowl. Obviously he wasn't the quarterback during the playoff time, but in the regular season he was a quarterback, and he would have most likely won MVP as well if he didn't get injured. And then he comes back and then still puts up solid performances, and then 2020 was just a complete disaster. And also I think that was the year where the Eagles also drafted Jalen Hurts in the second round.
I think so.
After Carson Wentz's poor performances, it was kind of evident that he just doesn't have a future with the Eagles. Maybe if they gave him another year, maybe he could have bounced back. I mean, who knows? But I think after that point, that when the Eagles just didn't want him after that horrible year, like let's say it wasn't a bad year, it was absolutely horrible. You could say that part of it is the money, but as I said, like 2019, he still played well. He could have just stopped performing after he got the extension, and he still performed. So I still think there is something with there. As I personally think, if he can fix these issues, he can still become like a top 20 quarterback in the league. Like I don't think his NFL career is like completely over as a starter, but he needs to work on his mental capabilities when it comes to the football field, because I mean his pocket presence, his awareness is not good at the moment. It's not enough for an NFL starter, especially for someone who's a 7-year veteran now at this point. So it's a very interesting case for sure.
Something we didn't discuss, but I think you can be a better judge here. If not the losing of incentives, if we trust you that the losing of incentives is not what caused him to decline, what factors can you outline for that decline? Maybe something specific to the Colts and the Commanders, but then he still struggled in 2020.
Yeah, I mean that's the issue. Like after the 2019 season, like it was he was like going into 2020, he was looked at as like a top 10, 15-ish quarterback, which is really good in the NFL, I'd say. And then he just I don't know if it was ever discussed really closely, but no one really knows what caused the fall off. I think it was just such a switch. It was like basically a different player on the field in 2020 compared to previous years. I don't know if maybe some similar situation happened as to like Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love to a lesser degree, that they drafted, even though they gave the biggest attention to Carson Wentz, I mean they still drafted a quarterback in the second round, which is quite a high position for them to draft a quarterback. Maybe that got into his head a little bit as well, as like they maybe saw it like even though he signed the extension, they still don't view him as the franchise quarterback because they still drafted one in the second round. So maybe that's probably what got to him. I mean, that would be my guess.
It got
'Cause
to him, and then it stayed with him in Indianapolis and
I think
DC.
for me, it's just that after the 2020 season, he just lost his confidence, and then he never really bounced back. I mean, with the Colts, you could say that he had a relatively decent season, but as I said, I mean, the couple of times I watched and actually like wanted to see how he performs, it really wasn't all that impressive. He still made some really poor decisions. He could have had a lot more interceptions as well in that season. So yeah, I mean, I think for first, I think it was a confidence issue because of Jalen Hurts, and then he just like lost all his confidence because of that one really bad season. And I mean, imagine you played for this team, you got them to the playoffs a couple years ago, and then they also won the Super Bowl, and you weren't able to be there. You play well for 2 more years after. You were looked at as the not savior, but yeah, basically the savior of Philadelphia, the franchise quarterback, and then they just draft another one in the second round. I mean, you could argue that because he's a professional athlete, he should be mentally strong enough that to the point that drafting Jalen Hurts shouldn't affect him, but maybe it didn't. Who knows? I mean, as I said, I'm just speculating. I think that is my opinion, that Jalen Hurts affected him. Maybe it's something completely different. Maybe it's not even mental. Maybe it's just true that he just signed a big session, and after that just couldn't care about football that much, and just lost some of this passion. But we will see. Hopefully, I mean, I hope he will bounce back. I like Carson Wentz, so I hope he can put it together maybe in a couple of years. But as of now, I think he has a lot of things to work on. I think
in big contracts, what happens more often? Do players actually go on to play better because they signed big contracts? Or do they indeed lose incentives and start really not pushing themselves?
That's the thing, as it was mentioned in the quote as well, players get paid for their previous achievements. So if someone like, let's say, if we wanted an example, Kenny Golladay got a huge contract from the Giants because he played quite well with Detroit for like 2 years. He got a huge contract. I'm not exactly sure how much of it was guaranteed, but it was like 4 years, 72 million. Probably a lot of it guaranteed, and he just never did anything for the Giants. So for a lot of players, I think it's just that yes, after they get paid, there's just no incentive to keep playing. But I think it's also it also depends if the player actually likes to play the sport, because the thing is, a lot of these athletes are professional athletes, but they don't really follow the sport otherwise that they play, because they just don't have an interest in it. They usually play it because they have the talent and they have the athletic skills to play it. So a lot of them just get into it at a young age and just continue playing until they make it to the pro league, and until they make enough money to be set for life. So yeah, I think a lot of players just get new contracts, and then after they get the big money that changes their lives, there's just no incentive for them to play anymore. If there are players who truly love the game and want to continue playing, then obviously a big contract isn't going to change their attitude and their mindset. But at this point, that's the thing. It's such a gamble with players, because you never know what side of a player you're going to get after a contract extension.
So I want to see if I've got your point correctly. So amongst players who love the game, there are too many factors to be able to say that for bad performance to necessarily be explained only by guaranteed money, which lead to losing incentives.
I would say, I mean, obviously contracts do play a big part in a player's performance, but that's not the only thing. Like, that's why I said it's such a different situation for every single athlete, because you never know the background. Maybe there are some mental problems, maybe there are some issues with the management that they have with the team. Like, a lot of times you see players sign new extensions with the team, and then a new regime comes in, maybe a new coach, new GM, and then the players just don't have the same views as their new coach or new management, and then you see performances like worse performances after that. So there are a lot of like exterior factors, I would say. It's not just that after a player gets big money, he just wants to quit. So I don't think it's that simple. There are definitely some cases where it's applicable, but I don't think it's
also age, injuries, coaching, way too many things that go into it.
There are so many factors going into it. A lot of them also combined, so like it's really difficult to understand
Yeah.
who you actually want to give a big contract to.
So bad performance would not necessarily be explained by lost incentives because of a big contract.
I would say in general, no.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. As a conclusion, we can say that both our guests at the literature review agree that career insurance very often and guaranteed money lead to a declining performance. However, when it comes to the topic more generally speaking, the Carsa Wentz example serving as an example here, we can see that this is one of just many factors that go into player performance improvements or declines. Okay, I would like to thank you for being a guest to our show, to our podcast, and I would like to thank everybody who listened to our podcast. And yeah, have a nice day.